How confident are you in pronouncing all these forms of the verb kaku correctly? If you have a feeling of opening a blind box, that indicates you've already identified the problem. It seems like each form of a verb has its own pitch accent. How should we organize and master them? Starting from this episode, I'll guide you through a series of videos with a precise dissection approach to help you thoroughly master the pitch accent of verbs. It's going to be a completely new way of thinking. Are you ready? Hey guys, welcome to Monochrome Japanese, a peaceful space where you can focus on your Japanese study. I'm your host, Shiho. Although not always the case, it seems that once the form changes, the pitch accent may also change. Therefore, we have every reason to believe that pitch accent changes are caused by changes in form. So, in this verb pitch accent series, I'll guide you through what I consider the most suitable framework to closely observe and thoroughly analyze the various forms of Japanese verbs. Before we begin, let's first establish some concepts and scope of discussion. First, starting today, we're introducing the concept of pitch accent nucleus. It's exactly what we've repeatedly mentioned in the fundamentals video as well as the pitch accent pattern series, the last high pitch mora. This way, we can refer to the pair of concepts introduced in the episode of noun-dependent words, flat type and falling type, as nucleus-less and nucleus-bearing, respectively, which will facilitate discussions in certain contexts. Secondly, it's necessary to introduce the pair of grammatical systems that exist in Japanese language education, the so-called school grammar and educational grammar. Although everyone's path and experience in learning Japanese might be different, when mentioning forms of verb, if you're more familiar with must form, nai form, te form, potential form, volitional form, and so on, it means that what you've learned is most likely the educational grammar. If you're more familiar with mizenkei, also known as imperfective form, renryokei, aka conjunctive form, kateikei, aka hypothetical form, and so on, this indicates that what you've learned is most likely the so-called school grammar. Although it's not possible to give a comprehensive comparison of the two in this episode, but I believe the latter, which is the school grammar, will undoubtedly be more helpful for the purpose of fully understanding the various forms of Japanese verbs. And just as mentioned earlier, understanding these forms is the key to mastering pitch accent changes in Japanese verbs. Therefore, this series of videos on Japanese pitch accent of verbs will be based on the school grammar system. However, even if you've never encountered this system before, don't worry, because first, it's just a different system. Second, I will frequently mention the corresponding concepts and terminologies from the educational grammar system to help you better understand. Additionally, I will make some slight adjustments to the existing school grammar system for the goal of mastering the pitch accent of various forms of verbs. Finally, although I mentioned this earlier, it's necessary to reiterate. This will be a completely new way of thinking. So first, there might be a few concepts along the way that contradicts your existing knowledge. Second, much of the early discussion may seem unrelated to the pitch accent results you care about most. But please reserve your judgment on whether it helps or not until the end of this episode, or even this entire series. Now, let's dive into it. First, get your chef's knife ready, as we're going to break down a very simple example. 書きます. If I ask you to divide it into two parts that make structural sense, based on your current understanding or just intuition, where would you cut it off? Most likely it would be here. That's totally fine. What if I asked you to break it down further? Where would you make the cut? It should at least be here. Actually, it can also be divided here. But for now, we don't need to address that. Notice that you can't make these two cuts on the must form of all the verbs. For example, these won't work. But conceptually, these three parts do exist. And this is the core approach to understanding various verb forms. However, this is just the beginning. The first cut you just made actually separated the conjugated form from the dependent word of this example. Now, notice that this is the first time I'm using the concept of conjugated form. Whether you're more familiar with the school grammar or educational grammar, I don't think is completely new to you. From now on, I'll first guide you to understand the conjugated forms under the school grammar system, and more importantly, the rarely mentioned pitch accent of these forms. In modern Japanese, verbs have these 6 conjugated forms, which are mizenkei or imperfective form, renyokei or conjunctive form, shushikei or terminal form, rentaikei or attributive form, kateikei or hypothetical form, and meireikei or imperative form. Then various dependent words connect to 5 of these conjugated forms except for the imperative form, based on semantic or formal requirements. For example, the auxiliary verb mas connects to a verb's conjunctive form, like the earlier example, kakimasu. In other words, kaki is the conjunctive form or renyokei of the verb kaku. Okay, now let's go through each conjugated form. First, mizenkei. As the term suggests, it primarily works with dependent words meaning action has not yet occurred. And the most common one would be the auxiliary verb that we're all very familiar with, nai. If we still take kaku as an example, we need to change it this way so that it can connect with nai. So we call this the mizenkei of kaku. 2 things to note here. First, in the context of educational grammar, we usually call this entire thing nai form. Second, even in other senses, mizenkei is also not equivalent to nai form. Because besides nai, it can also connect with other dependent words. I'll make a dedicated video to cover this later, as it's not only important, but also very special. Okay, here comes the key point. What is its pitch accent? Actually, it's the same as kaku, so it's pronounced kaka. Yes, you heard me correctly. kaka. Let's continue for now. Second, 連用形. We already mentioned that the 連用形 of kaku is kaki. You should have already noticed that this pitch accent is also consistent with kaku. 連用形 means the form that connects with yogen, or declinable words, which you might have already heard of. It contrasts with taigen, or substantive, and mainly refers to various types of word that conjugate and work as predicates or components of predicate, such as verbs, adjectives, and not adjectives. From the perspective dependent words, more often it refers to various auxiliary verbs, supplementary verbs, etc. For auxiliary verbs that connect to 連用形, besides ます, there are also たい, ながら, なさい, etc. For supplementary verbs connected through the conjunctive particle て or で, we have いる, ある, 置く, etc. Of course, when connected to kaku, euphonic change happens. So you'll discover that the must form in the educational grammar is not equivalent to this 連用形 in the school grammar system. Another thing to note here is, although 連用形 almost always connects with one or more dependent words, it can also be used independently. This is what's called 連用中止法, which I translate as the suspensive usage of conjunctive form, or sometimes called must stem for suspension in the context of educational grammar. For example, 彼は何度も書き、言葉を選び、慎重にその大事な手紙を仕上げた。Many people have asked me about the pitch accent of this 連用中止法. And now I believe everyone should know it, right? Next up, 終止形 and 連体形. In the vast majority of cases in modern Japanese, these two forms are completely consistent with their base form or dictionary form. The pitch accent is, of course, also the same. So let's just briefly look at the differences in their usage. As the term suggests, the former refers to the form that directly ends a sentence. But this doesn't mean it cannot connect with any dependent words. The most common ones are all the conjunctive particles, such as から, と, し, が, and the けど group, etc. We can consider it as they turn a sentence that ended with 終止形 of verbs into a subordinate clause. 連体形 should also be quite straightforward. The form that connects with or modifies taigen. In contrast to yogen, taigen mainly refers to nouns or pronouns. This should be very easy, so let's move on. Then there's 家庭形. In modern Japanese, it only connects with one dependent word, which is the conjunctive particle ば. So its complete form is the same as the ば form in educational grammar. And we should already be quite familiar with it. Okay, here comes the key point. The pitch accent of this 家庭形 is also consistent with kaku, pronounced kake. Alright, finally, 命令形. If you remember, I mentioned earlier that this is the only conjugated form that usually doesn't connect with any dependent words, but used directly. I think the reason is also quite clear. Additionally, as a Japanese learner, this is a form you probably won't say a lot. As for the pitch accent, it's also consistent with kaku, pronounced kake. Okay, these are the conjugated forms taught in the school grammar system and their respective pitch accents. You must have already noticed this. Their pitch accents are completely the same. However, you should also have at least two questions. First, we only used the group 1 verb as the example. What about the conjugated forms of other verbs? They don't seem as this simple. Second, this is just a falling type verb. What about flat type verbs? If you have these two questions, it means you're following along and participating, which is excellent. Now let's explore these two questions. Since the second question is about flat type verbs, why don't we first continue looking at group 2 and 3 verbs of falling type, and then observe all the flat type verbs together? This might be the most convenient approach. Okay, speaking of falling type group 2 verbs, let's use this as an example, because we all should be very familiar with its pitch accent. At the same time, based on our existing knowledge, it shouldn't be difficult to derive the remaining 4 conjugated forms. If we completely remove all the dependent words, it becomes clearer. So now the question is, why do the conjugated forms of this group 2 verb, which is relatively more popular for its easy conjugation, look somewhat irregular? Due to the compositional peculiarity of group 2 verbs, before revealing the pitch accents of the remaining 4 conjugated forms, we need to first resolve several issues. First, let's make a comparison with the conjugated forms of kaku. Now, let's recall the 2 cuts we made earlier on kakimasu. We already know that the first cut separates the conjugated form and the dependent word. So we can once again clearly point it out. What's listed here is only the part of conjugated forms. Okay, now let's look at the second cut you made. This second cut actually separates the stem part and the suffix part of a conjugated form. If we also make the second cut on all the conjugated forms of kaku, it would be like this. You'll discover the stem never changes, while the suffix may change. This looks very neat, but taberu doesn't work this way. Do you remember I mentioned earlier that tabemasu can't have the same 2 cuts? Now you should discover the problem. After removing the dependent word mas, it seems only this stem part that never changes in all the conjugated forms remains. Moreover, it seems that except for the mizenke and renyoke of taberu, all other conjugated forms listed here have their pitch accent nucleus on the last mora of the stem. Since the suffix only has 1 mora, we can also say these conjugated forms all have their pitch accent nucleus on the penultimate mora. If you're not sure, you actually only need to verify the kateke of taberu, which is tabereba, hence tabere. No problem, right? So now we only need to look at the mizenke and renyoke of taberu. Let's first look at 렌요케. We know that the conjunctive particle te connects to the 렌요케 of a verb and doesn't change its pitch accent. So we can find out the pitch accent of its 렌요케 from its te form. So, how should this be pronounced? If you've watched my other videos, you should know this is pronounced tabete. Therefore, the 렌요케 of taberu should be pronounced tabe. Its 미zenke is also the same. Yes, you heard me correctly. Tabe. If this is the case, the rule of pitch accent nucleus comes on the penultimate mora seems to completely apply to all conjugated forms of group 1 and 2 verbs. Okay, I know this is a good time to bring up the following words, because these seem to be exceptions. But is that really the case? Let's observe them. Besides all being the shushike or rentaike of a group 1 verb, with the pitch accent nucleus on the antepenultimate mora, they actually have another thing in common. Have you noticed? It might be easier to notice this way. That's right. Their first 2 moras, that is, the stem part, all contain diphthongs or long vowels. This way, their second mora becomes what's called a special mora, which doesn't bear the pitch accent nucleus. Therefore, it's generally believed that the conjugated forms of these verbs also originally follow the rule of pitch accent nucleus comes on the penultimate mora, but their penultimate mora happens to be a special mora, so only in terms of results, they've become exceptions. Okay, we're done with the conjugated forms of the first 2 groups of falling type verbs. We still have one last to cover, which is the group 3 verb, kuru. We know its ba form is kureba, and the conjunctive particle ba also doesn't change the pitch accent of its preceding part, so its kateke is pronounced kure. As for the meileke, I believe we should be familiar with it already, right? It's pronounced koi. Finally, let's look at the mizenke and renyoke. We know that when kuru connects with the auxiliary verb nai, it becomes konai. Although it's already quite obvious, the low flat pitch of nai further confirms that the nucleus-bearing nature of this stem part, even though it only has 1 mora. So we can totally consider that the mizenke, which is ko, and the renyoke ki, both have a high pitch. Okay, up to this point, we've actually observed the pitch accents of all conjugated forms of nucleus-bearing verbs. Have you noticed any patterns? That's right. The applicable scope of that rule we derived, pitch accent nucleus comes on the penultimate mora, has further expanded, right? Actually, besides kuru, there are also a few nucleus-bearing 2 mora group 2 verbs, common ones like miru, deru, eru, heru, whose mizenke and renyoke also only has 1 mora. So, except for mizenke and renyoke of this type of verbs, we can say all conjugated forms of nucleus-bearing verbs essentially follow the rule of pitch accent nucleus comes on the penultimate mora. Okay, next comes nucleus-less verbs. I'm going to leave this task to you. How does it sound? if you have understood the content of this video up to now, this should be very easy for you. You can use these 3 verbs as examples, but it's not required. If you plan to complete this task, you can pause here because I'll give the results in 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you for your effort. I wonder if you have already discovered this good news. The conjugated forms of nucleus-less verbs are also nucleusless, right? Combined with what we just derived regarding the pitch accent of conjugated forms of nucleus-bearing verbs, we can say the conjugated forms of nucleus-bearing verbs are also nucleus-bearing, and except for misenke and renyoke of a very few verbs, the pitch accent nucleus comes on the penultimate mora. If these 2 points are acceptable, we can think a bit further. It seems that the pitch accents of all the conjugated forms of a verb are completely consistent with the dictionary form or base form, or simply what we introduced today as the shushike and rentaike of that verb. This point is self-evident for nucleus-less verbs. And for nucleus-bearing verbs, even for conjugated forms of group 2 and 3 verbs having different mora counts, either the position of the pitch accent nucleus or the nucleus-bearing attribute itself is consistent with the base form. Looking at it this way, this conclusion is completely valid. Okay, here comes the most core question of this video. If the pitch accents of conjugated forms are all consistent with the base form, then why do the pitch accents of these forms sound almost all different? Here's a point that needs to be reiterated. We're primarily using the school grammar system. In other words, the conjugated forms we're talking about here only refer to these parts. Except kakeru and kako, which need further explanation in another episode. The pitch accents of the conjugated form part of these 8 forms are indeed consistent with kaku. So, perhaps you've already guessed. Since the pitch accent of conjugated forms remains consistent, the reason for the pitch accent changes in these forms doesn't lie in the conjugated forms. That's right. It's the dependent words that complicate things here. This is the most important conclusion of this video as the introduction episode of this series on the pitch accent of verbs. The real factor causing pitch accent changes in various forms of a verb is the many dependent words that connect to its different conjugated forms, because they have certain specific relationships with, or effects to, if you will, the conjugated forms they connect to, in terms of pitch accent. Therefore, in the next couple of episodes, I'll guide you to learn about these commonly used dependent words and their pitch accents in the order of conjugated forms, covering different types of pitch accent interactions between the conjugated forms and dependent words. Stay tuned. Okay, that's all for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please subscribe to my channel and share my videos with anyone you know that's learning Japanese or interested in this language. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.